Pope Francis made a two-day apostolic visit to Greece and Cyprus last week. Joining me now to analyze some of the papal statements and much more is the Papal Posse, editor-in-chief of the Catholic Thing, Robert Royal, and canon lawyer and priest of the Archdiocese of New York, Father GERALD Murray, both on the road this week for shame. Thank you, gents, for being with us. Now, during Pope Francis's visit to Greece last week, he warned against a retreat from democracy. He said, democracy demands hard work and patience. It is complex, whereas authoritarianism is peremptory, and populism's easy answers appear attractive. Bob, what do you make of this, particularly at a time when liberal democracies seem to be pretty authoritarian these days?
Yeah, look, his general point, of course, is correct. On the one hand, he said you want to avoid empires. It's like, I think actually the term he used, and he's in the home of the birthplace of democracy in Greece. And so, yes, that internationalism that we're all worried about, that seems to be pushing aside all our national traditions, that is something worth warning about. And then also the kind of authoritarianism. There are various kinds of authoritarianism. We're seeing a lot of authoritarianism from the left these days here in the United States and in most of Europe. So, in broad terms, what he said is okay. The problem is it seems to me that of course, it's easy to set up, I don't want to necessarily call them straw men, but these extremes without naming any names. And so, yeah, it's worth warning us. But what exactly it applies to, it's very difficult to say. And look, let's face it, there is a crisis of democracy in this country. There is one also in Europe and in other places around the world. And we're slowly trying to figure our way out to a new moment in our politics, in our economics, and in our moral cultural realm as well. So it's a good warning. I don't know that it gets us very far, but at least he put it out there.
Yeah. Also in Greece, Pope Francis was met with some antagonism. An elderly Greek Orthodox priest heckled Pope Francis as he headed into a meeting with the Orthodox Archbishop in Athens. Watch this. Father Jerry, that Orthodox priest was calling the Pope a heretic. Is this part of the old mistrust that still exists between Catholic and the Orthodox Church, or is something else at play here?
It's not immediately evident, Raymond, what's happening now. It is true that some of the Orthodox Christians still have a hostile attitude to Roman Catholicism and would call us heretics. That could be at play. But who knows? He may be referring to other things that he doesn't agree with the Pope on. But certainly that kind of behavior is unacceptable. The Pope is the guest of the Greek Orthodox bishops there, going in to meet with them. So that behavior was completely out of bounds.
Yeah. Later in the journey, the Pope addressed one of his, really it's a theme of his pontificate, migration and migrants. In Nicosia, he said that the God was encouraging a dream of humanity free from walls of division and hostility, where there are no longer strangers, but only fellow citizens. Now, Bob, this has been a customary theme of Pope Francis, as I've said, welcoming the migrant, which is certainly part of church teaching. But this sounds like a plea for open borders.
Yeah, and he got some pushback. You may have seen in the reports that the Archbishop of Athens and Greece, I think that's the right term, or the Metropolitan of Athens and all Greece, said to him that he warned that Turkey is using migration as a weapon against Greece. Now, Greece itself, of course, is a part of the West. It's a democracy. It's got a lot of economic problems and has for many years. And a kind of uncontrolled arrival, especially of problematic, I think we have to say this bluntly, Muslim arrival in the West in small numbers is absorbable. We do it here in the United States, and some other countries do it as well. But a country like Greece, Italy, I think, is in the same circumstance. France and England have much larger waves of migration that come into them. I think that the Greek patriarch, if I've got his title correct, was right in saying to him, look, this is also a political question, that the Turks are trying to overwhelm us with these refugees from the Middle East. We can't simply have open borders because our society and our economy are already troubled. And for him to make this broad statement, it's true. It's theologically true. We have to worry about refugees and migrants and whatnot. But the prudence of what can happen in any set of circumstances is much more complicated. So I think that the Greek leader was right to remind him about that. And I wish that this would penetrate a bit into the Vatican, because they just seem to be so sort of monochromatically fixed on this idea that we must accept all available refugees and migrants, that it isn't very helpful in practical terms.
Well, it's a one-size-fits-all solution that doesn't apply in pockets of the world, Greece being a good example. Moving on to the end of the visit, Pope Francis stumbled, Father Jerry, briefly ascending the stairs of the papal plane when he began his trip back to Rome. This brings up a subject of the Pope's health, which is making the rounds of the news this week. I saw a number of articles, including a report by veteran journalist John Gizzi, writing for Newsmax. He says that his source at the Vatican told him that Francis is, quote, dying and not expected to live past 2022. Your thoughts on the veracity of this report? I mean, we've all heard this kind of rumor. I get a little squeamish when I see it in print and people start pushing it as if it's, established truth without any real fact pattern here.
Sure. This is based on the Pope's age, on the fact that he had that surgery earlier this year for in his intestines, had part of his intestines removed. But nobody knows how long the Pope is going to live and how long most people are going to live. Certainly, we're all concerned about the Pope's health. It's painful to see him. I know his sciatica it pains him, and it's painful for us to see him suffering as he's walking up the aisle at St. Peter's and the like. But I think it's rash and sensationalistic to say that the Vatican is preparing for the next conclave because everybody there expects the Pope to die. We just don't know when that's going to happen. What we should be doing is praying for him that he get all the best medical attention and be able to have his sciatica relieved and any other problems dealt with in the best way possible.
Bob, is it appropriate to report on the health of a pope?
Well, I think it is, but I agree with Father that there can be a kind of a sensationalism here. As you rightly say, we've all heard these rumors that he has a cancer or other things that are going around. And it hasn't been reported anywhere else because, first of all, we're all going to die someday. It's just a matter of when. And even with the best medical knowledge, you can't entirely predict when a person is going to die. And to me, he looked, despite that fall, he still looks fairly robust. So I just think it's kind of, you want to be cautious in reporting these sorts of things. Let's face it, the Pope is not like a secular authority figure. If Joe Biden he obviously shows some signs of dementia, but if Joe Biden were at the point where he could not carry out his duties, we would all want to know about that because he's a public figure. The Pope occupies a different space. So it's a little bit sensitive to decide when you report on this and when you don't. But I myself would err on the side of reticence because he's a different type of figure. And until we have some really solid information about what's going on, all this is just speculation.
Yeah, well, I agree with you. You need a fact pattern here. You need to know what is exactly going on, and sources close to the action who can share that. I don't see any of that. I see kind of sensational headlines and Roman gossip, but give me a couple of gelato and a plate of pasta, and I could probably get the same story. Pope Francis late last week accepted the resignation of Paris Archbishop Michel Aupetit, who offered to quit over a questionable relationship with a woman back in 2012. Now, though the cleric has vigorously denied any physical relationship with a woman, the Pope quickly accepted the resignation because of rumors of an illicit relationship. They claimed they were too damaging. Father, your thoughts There have been a number of clerics who have offered resignations for different reasons. The Pope is usually reticent to accept those, even from bishops who failed to move quickly against sexual abusers. Why accept this resignation?
Well, there's a lot of mystery here, Raymond, and a lot of unsatisfactory things going on. The whole story basically is that the Archbishop of Paris had sent an email last year in which he inadvertently revealed to members of his staff a relationship which dated back to when he was Vicar General in Paris. And that led to the nuncio being informed. The Vatican commissioned Cardinal Vantois to do an investigation, but none of that was really known outside of the Paris Chancery until Le Point newspaper, or magazine rather, reported on it last week. And that led to denial by the Archbishop. And then he said, well, the relationship with the secretary was ambiguous. What that means, we're not quite sure. And then very surprisingly, when the Pope accepted the resignation, he was asked about it, and he started describing the nature of the accusations, including that the Archbishop had committed caresses or engaged in caresses and massages of the secretary. It's a female secretary, so it was a laywoman who worked in his office. And everybody was surprised because that was not known publicly. And then the Pope, in addition, started minimalizing the nature of that kind of behavior, which for most people would say, well, you don't give massages to your secretary. That's workplace harassment. And it certainly is a leading indicator, we could say, that perhaps other behavior is going on. We hope not. And he's denied that there was any sexual component. So what we have here is workplace sexual harassment, quite clearly, according to current legal standards. But then the Pope accepting a resignation while saying he's doing this on the altar not of truth, but of hypocrisy. But the hypocrisy is not quite clear. What are we talking about here? This is public pressure.
Yeah, he's claiming it was the gossip and, the hypocrisy of those making the charges, and that this really isn't all that bad. But then he accepts the resignation. Bob, your reaction?
Yeah, I think I was kind of disturbed. He said that, these are the sins of the flesh, which are not the most serious sins. Right. Now, I don't know if it's right for a pope to be saying things like this. I often, when I teach Dante, point out to the students that the sexual sins are the lightest sins for which a person can be damned. And the reason is, of course, because it's kind of an interpersonal love that takes place, and it's a mistaken type of love that is expressed. But to say that, they're not, the sexual sins are not the worst sins, when in fact, they're the most common ones. There's a reason why those sins of incontinence, the sexual sins, greed, gluttony, etc., are warned against, because most of us are not going to commit murder or suicide or felonies or fraud, whatever they might be. These are the places where people get weak. And I have to say, I can't imagine any previous pope saying about a sexual misconduct that it's not the worst thing. There's nowhere in the gospel where Jesus ever says that any sin is minor. He may forgive somebody and say, go and sin no more, but he never just says, well, it's not the worst of the sins. That's really a very poor standard to set, and I wish he did
Father
not
Jerry.
say that.
Yeah, Father Jerry, as you pointed out, the Pope said, and I'll read the quote, he said this was small caresses and a massage given to his secretary, speaking of the Archbishop of Paris, before he was the Archbishop of Paris. He says there is a sin there, this is the Pope, but not the worst kind. He also added, sins of the flesh are not the most serious, ranking pride and hatred higher. Father, if these sorts of sins are not such a big deal, why accept the resignation? What's the message here, quickly?
I guess the message here is that public pressure works, and that the Pope must have been convinced that this was serious enough to take his resignation, even though saying it wasn't that serious, which again poses a problem because if the man is being unjustly punished, it's being done by his superior in the church, which is something we're not supposed to do. Or, as I see it, what he did was completely unacceptable, and it's a good thing he resigned, because we don't want the Archbishop of Paris to be someone that people don't trust. He took the nomination as Bishop of Paris knowing about this previous behavior. That's putting the whole church at risk if it ever comes public. So I think the outcome is satisfactory, but as Bob was saying, the papal comments were regrettable, sad to say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we should also say that the Archbishop claims there was no physical contact aside, there was no intimacies. It was restricted to the things the Pope described. So, I mean, this is, considering some who continue to hold positions of power in the church, who have done far, more explicit, engaged in far more explicit activities, I was a bit taken back by the resignation, I have to say. Also causing some controversy this week, in correspondence this year with the notorious Catholic LGBT activist group New Ways Ministry, Pope Francis commended the group for its work, referring to Sister Janine Gramick as a valiant woman. Well, in 1999, the CDF declared Gramick and her colleague, Father Robert Nugent, were to cease their ministry due to ambiguities and errors in their outreach. Now, this was signed by Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger. Father, why is the Pope apparently praising this group, who's been officially sanctioned? They also removed them from the Vatican Synod website this week. So there's a lot of talk about mixed messaging. Here we go again.
This is on a par with the Pope sending a letter to Father James Martin, praising him for his outreach work to people with a homosexual problem. This is mystifying and really, in a sense, infuriating, because Sister Gramick and her organization, New Ways Ministry, have not changed anything about their approach since they were condemned by Cardinal Ratzinger back, during the pontificate of John Paul II. This is what causes confusion and really despair to a degree among Catholics who are trying to uphold the moral order, that someone who's promoting homosexual activity, same-sex marriage, things that are completely anathema and immoral, that they're getting a letter of praise from the Pope. I think the Pope was very ill-advised, made a terrible mistake in writing, because Sister Gramick's condemnation was never withdrawn, and she's never repented from the things that she was rightly accused and found to have, in fact, committed, which is to take Catholic doctrine and toss it aside in favor of basically a secularistic, liberal sexual ethics, which is just terrible, terrible.
Yeah, the New Ways Ministries website was listed on the Vatican Synodal website. They were removed this week after, I guess, they were made aware of the Bishops' Conference in the United States condemning the group. So interesting how this is shaking out. But again, the mixed messaging is very confusing to the Catholic in the pew. The National Catholic Register's Ed Penton is reporting this week on that ongoing financial scandal trial at the Vatican. He reports that last month, Pope Francis was mentioned by a key witness during the proceedings, claiming that Francis squashed reportage of the extortion attempts alleged to have been committed by the key witness himself. Now, Bob, this begs a question. How much did the Pope know about this scandal, and when did he know it?
Yeah, this is a very complicated, financial transactions are always very complicated. And as we keep seeing, we keep unwinding one part of it and unwinding another, and it points in one direction and then another. This is the first, for a long time, Archbishop Perlasca, who's the one you were just speaking about, was sort of held out of the testimony. And then he came forward. We don't know if he was induced to come forward or he was given assurances that he would not himself be prosecuted. But this is the first indication that we have that it didn't just go up to the Vatican Secretary of State and that the Pope himself may have been involved. I mean, that said, we don't know that this means anything sinister. It may just mean that he was asked to sign off on this, and it was a large investment of money in a property in London. It looked like a good investment because London real estate prices were very hot at the time. And maybe he had to come in and sign off on something that large. We just don't know. But it's still, it's remarkable that when we start to trace down a problem like this, it goes, we think it's a bunch of lower level officials, and now it leads right up to the Holy Father. And let's hope that this trial sorts things out fairly for everybody concerned.
Father, how does this revelation affect the case canonically? I asked Cardinal Pell last week how can the public have confidence in the justice of this court if the Pope is changing the rules constantly? And he's done it, I think, 4 times now. The rules have slightly adjusted, and the Pope has kind of weighed in on the case.
Well, the problem that Ed Penton identified here is that this Monsignor Perlasca, who had signed off on a $15 million payoff to the guy who was extorting the money, who's been accused, he says that he did that under instructions from higher authority, meaning the Pope. And there's a question of backdated authorizations. There's a question of the prosecutor interviewed the Pope, but then none of those details, no transcript of the questions and answers was ever provided to the defense. So what we have here is a case where, in fact, the Pope is been implicated in what basically was a decision not to bring not to bring the offender to justice by suing him in court, but rather paying him off 15 million euros so that the Vatican can get control over a property that he was supposed to be buying on behalf of the Vatican, not on behalf of himself. So, as Bob said, very complicated, but trust will be restored if the court proceedings follow accepted standards of Western justice, which is the prosecution and the defense have equal access to all the evidence, and that witnesses who give testimony in the form of depositions are then brought into court and questioned so that we can compare their answers then and now to try and arrive at justice. But it's mysterious because, as you mentioned, the Pope, for instance, Monsignor Perlasca was given amnesty, essentially. He would not be prosecuted if he became a witness. But in American cases, you don't give amnesty before someone testifies. You wait till they testify, and then you say, if you testify honestly and accurately, then you'll be given either a reduced sentence or whatever. So as an observer without full knowledge, all I can say is I hope this plays out in accord with what we expect to happen in a modern Western courtroom.
Before we run out of time, news broke this week from China that Catholic businessman and democracy activist Jimmy Lai has been convicted, as expected, by the Chinese Communist government for participating in a vigil marking the Tiananmen Square massacre. Father Jerry, then Bob, very quickly, your thoughts on what this means for freedom in Hong Kong. And I ask you both to quickly weigh in. President Biden said we're going to have a diplomatic boycott of the upcoming Olympics in China. Does that go far enough?
Well, let's, number one, about Jimmy Lai, pray for him. He is a good man. He was doing what anybody else does in a free Western country or any free society, which is demonstrate with your fellow citizens to get your point across. No, Communist China has shut down Hong Kong as a free part of China, and this is what they do. The Chinese communists are completely untrustworthy, and for the United States to make a boycott at the diplomatic boycott at the Olympics is praiseworthy. I praise the president for that, but we got to be stronger because we don't want symbolic action simply. More reports are coming out of the persecution of Uyghur Muslims in China. Why isn't this making people more aware that the Chinese Communist government has to be told, if you want to do business in the modern world, you can't act like this brutal dictatorship that you are. Change the way you act. So let's hope there's some of that.
Bob, I'm going to give you the last word.
Yeah, I mean, Jimmy Lai is a hero. He is really one of the great living human beings, I believe. He could have fled the country as they were starting to crack down on democratic voices in China, and he chose not to. He chose to stay there and face the music. So, I mean, we have to really pray for him and praise him and bring him up whenever we possibly can. I think that the diplomatic boycott is very weak. I suppose you can say it's a good thing, but if I were the Chinese, frankly, I would be saying, good. We won't have to bother with those American diplomats when they're here. They don't like it because it's kind of an insult to their, to their dignity. But really, China, we're seeing more and more that China is going to be a real threat in the world. And they don't really care very much about what the rest of the world does. And we have to factor that into account when we're dealing with them.
Yeah, diplomatic boycott, I think, is not nearly as strong as a media boycott. NBC and others broadcasting these games should shut out all coverage of it, and then they should stop trading with them in any way until they repair their human rights and religious rights record and set people like Jimmy Lai free. We'll leave it there, gentlemen. For commentary by Robert Royal and Father Gerald Murray, you can visit thecatholicthing.org. Thank you both.